Good evening, wisdom seekers, and welcome to the Wisdom Track podcast from the British Association of Anger Management, or BAAM for short. The Wisdom Track is where we take a holistic look at our core values of increasing self-awareness, honing emotional intelligence, and learning communication skills. You can find us over at angermanage.co.uk, and you can also subscribe to the Wisdom Track podcast over at Apple Podcasts or Spotify or something called Buzzsprout. If you're watching on YouTube or Facebook, then please remember to like, comment, and subscribe. The topic for today's podcast is what's love got to do with it? We're talking about how couples can help each other through tough times rather than let those challenges drive them apart. We'll talk about that a bit more in a minute, but first, let's meet today's expert panel. Vicky Zimmerman has been dubbed the chick-lit novelist it's okay to like. Hey Vicky, how's it going?
Yeah, not bad, thanks, Steve. How are you?
I'm feeling good. Thank you very much, Vicky. Vicky's books take a realistic but rewarding and very funny look at the truths behind our relationships with others and ourselves. Her first novel, Pear-Shaped, sold over 150,000 copies, and both that and the 7 subsequent books have been translated into 6 languages. Vicky, hey. So you only your latest book was published under the name Vicky Zimmerman. And for the rest of them, you used the pen name Stella Newman, which
right.
people may have heard of. Now, I would love to have an alter ego. Why did you decide to dump yours?
Well, I think it's a 2-part question, actually. Why did I decide to adopt it in the first place? And then why did I abandon it? My first book, Pear-Shaped, was a very thinly veiled, basically autobiographical story about a deeply emotionally dysfunctional relationship that I'd just come out of. I should say my books are comedies, but nonetheless quite dark comedies. And the boyfriend I was writing about was very litigious, very wealthy, and I was quite scared of him. Also, I was also in love with him, so I wanted to write about the relationship from the safety of a pseudonym. So I was hiding, basically, and I felt safer. I felt I had more license to write things that I would have perhaps felt ashamed or embarrassed to put in my own name. And then the book became, I was lucky, it was a bestseller, and by the time it had been translated to languages, I was over. I had written it in my own name at that point, but it was too late by then. And my publishers, obviously in publishing, like any other content, you try and build a brand. So the next series of books was written under the false name of Stella Newman, but the recent book, I put it in my own name, partly because it's basically to do with my own grandmother, and I felt it was time to come out of hiding. And at this point in my writing career, if I'm embarrassed or ashamed about what I'm writing, I shouldn't be writing it. So yeah, that's why.
And this book would be The Woman Who Wanted More, available now from waterstones.com and all good bookshops, yeah?
Yes, it's got a different title in the US. It's called Miss Cecily's Recipes for Exceptional Women, which is a tongue twister, but the central character is called Cecily.
I like that title.
Thank you. I like it more. I didn't choose either title because I think people think authors get to choose their own titles, but the editors choose the titles. But thank you.
Yeah, you must be quite successful if you've got to the point where someone else says, no, we've got to call it this. So our next special guest is David Waters. So David is a New York-based psychotherapist specializing in relationships. He started out as a journalist and was part of the team that made Men's Health into the world's best-selling men's magazine. He's a founding faculty member of Alain de Botton's School of Life, and he writes regularly for the Financial Times, the New York Observer, and more. Plus, you can read his monthly well-being column at Digital Gentleman's Outfitter par excellence, Mr. Porter. David, welcome to the Wisdom Track.
Thank you very much, Steve. Very, very happy to be here. Yeah, I moved to New York about 3 years ago. I also work in the coaching space as well. And essentially my work with couples is really informed by all of my kind of therapeutic approach, which is essentially about, you know, the necessity of relationships and how we form healthy relationships. Without relationships, without the ability to connect, we are really going to struggle. And it's, you know, I'm super excited to be here today because to talk about, you know, the struggles couples are having this year under lockdown is just so uppermost in so many of our minds, myself included. You know, I'm a married guy. You know, my husband and I are at times struggling ourselves in our 1-bedroom apartment in New York City. So it's both a personally relevant discussion point, but also, you know, something that really fuels my work as well.
Yeah, I hope it isn't one of those Manhattan apartments where the TV's on top of the wardrobe. And I mean, so we know each other obviously from back in the glory days of men's magazines, and the viewers may have noticed that you know, you're a very sartorially elegant guy, and of course you were in the fashion team at Men's Health. Now, fashion gets a bit of a bad rap, doesn't it, in the well-being community?
Yeah, I think it's seen as perhaps being, you know, rather superficial or trivial and so on. And the fashion world is not always able to present itself as being other than that. But, you know, I like good clothes. I like, you know, dressing up. I mean, this year for a lot of us, we've been slobbing around in, you know, track bottoms and T-shirts. But, you know, I think anything that gives us pleasure, that is, you know, engages ourselves with how we are appearing to others, you know, can potentially be very valuable. There are challenges with the fashion world. I mean, I think there's a lot of surface kind of behavior. You know, there's a tendency to certain kinds of narcissism, perhaps more than other industries, but it also provides huge amounts of pleasure and enjoyment and employment too. So, you know, it's never just one thing.
That's certainly the most impressive lockdown haircut that I've seen.
I had to do it myself for a while. Which
you did it yourself?
Another story, but no, I now go to a barber. So I'm there with my mask on and he's got his mask on, and somehow we do this dance, but I get my hair cut. But yeah, thank you very much.
Very impressive results. So let's bring on our regular panelists. Snake Bloomstrand is a counsellor whose work with maximum security inmates at Folsom Prison is showcased in multiple award-winning documentary The Work, now available on Amazon Prime. His books, including Every Story Comes to an End, are out now. Snake joining us from rural paradise in Minnesota. Welcome.
Glad to be here.
How are you feeling, Snake?
Great.
Another in person with an alter ego. But you have completely left Craig behind, and now you are only Snake. The Snake has taken over. Is this correct?
I've been Snake for about 30 years, and so yeah, it's pretty well stuck. In fact, I don't object to Craig, but when I do hear it, I don't connect with it in any particular way. So it's been that long.
You just go, "Who's Craig?" You know.
Yeah.
Finally, Mike Fisher is the founder of the British Association of Anger Management. Mike's book, Beating Anger, is considered the key text in anger management worldwide. And in this month alone, he's appeared in UK newspapers, Metro, the Daily Telegraph, and the Times. Mike, hello.
Hi, Steve.
Mike, how are you feeling today?
You know, I stopped drinking, I stopped eating sugar and I stopped drinking soda pop. And I can't tell you, having cut sugar from my life, I feel about 20 years younger. I feel like a gladiator.
How long have you been cut sugar?
At this point, I think it's nearly 4 months, and I just feel fantastic. So, you know, whoever's listening, that might be the cue to transform your life. Just cut out sugar.
What's your favorite fizzy pop, as the song goes?
Well, I'm embarrassed to say, but it has to be Coca-Cola.
What full fat, capital C, Coca-Cola, yeah?
Absolutely, man. I get that sugar hit and I feel it instantly. But you know, I don't even have to do Coke anymore. Just feeling so much better. I'm feeling awesome. I'm feeling fabulous. And of course, I'm extremely happy.
My favorite is Black Grape Car, which my Dutch ex described as cancer in a can. So let's not allow today's topic to fester, because we're talking about arguments. So Snake, you wrote over on the blog, angermanaged.co.uk, a very eloquent piece about how maybe there's such a thing as good arguments, disagreements, and bad arguments, conflict. And maybe the key to the difference between the two of those is learning to love oneself before one can love somebody else. Could you want to talk a bit more about that and give us some more details about that?
Is how, particularly given the world today, with the politics and with the social situation, we are face to face with one another in ways that we never have been before. And it's striking to me that the social discourse that takes place out in the public is a lot more combative than it is trying to reconcile differences. Now, that's just an observation, and I certainly don't want to go into politics in any way, but I wonder at the influence of that on our personal relationships. It's been difficult to work. It's been difficult for people to educate their skills or educate their children. There's a tremendous amount of adaptation that requires negotiation and can give rise to disagreements over how to proceed. And I wonder at our having lost the skill or neglected the skill of disagreeing with one another. And so I felt it was valuable for us to focus on that. What is the goal? Certainly, when I've entered into different relationships, there's this wonderful Norman Rockwell point at the beginning where everything's about discovery and everything's perfect. And sooner or later, real life comes in and we get to know one another. What happens then? And the quarantine and being isolated has exacerbated that or sped it up in many cases. I know I mentioned when we were talking earlier that I've talked to 3 different couples in the last week who are certain they're going to split up. It's too much for them. And a lot of it, what's at the root of it, is the inability to disagree in a constructive way. Instead, it's caused a little bit wounding. And so what I'd like us to talk about to a certain degree is the notion of what is constructive disagreement and what's love got to do with it? It's a generous act because it does require that we're aware of the emotional charge we may have, regulate that, discipline it. It brings up questions of what are my boundaries around this? What am I willing to take a stand for? And what am I willing to let go of? Certainly all of those things come from a loving heart and an aware heart in terms of, I guess what I want to finish with is there's been so many times where I've been locked up in disagreement with people and suddenly there's an aha and a third option shows up. That's what I'm looking for out of disagreements. It doesn't necessarily solve everything, but to agree to disagree or to see how important it is to another person it is they desire or shape it, oftentimes ends up creating an amalgam of 2 polarized positions into something neither person imagined. And so when we talk about the benefit of disagreement, that's my target. That's what I aim for. And it isn't always possible, but it's worth aiming for. So I'll leave it there. I'm sure there's lots to talk about around this.
So, Mike,
sorry, can I just jump in?
Yes, absolutely.
I love what you've just said, and I would add to that. I mean, when we have leaders, when we have a kind of culture around us where conflict seems to be the norm, and conflict that really isn't being resolved in ways that we can see as hopeful or positive, or that, involve some kind of compromise, but things are very, to use a sort of psychoanalytic term, very split. There's a huge amount of splitting, and feeds into social media. You know, I love it, I hate it. You know, the rage and anger we might see on a platform like Twitter or elsewhere, and you know, people are very polarized. It's sort of around us, and then we've been forced together in our relationships in very uncertain times with huge amounts of fear surrounding us. And I think that kind of culture around us, that kind of white noise, if you like, behind us all, is fueling this idea of conflict that can't be resolved, and also that, you know, things are either categorically right or categorically wrong. And that's just not a helpful kind of concept. You know, most things are a kind of mushy middle, you know, of grayness, which may not be as sexy or as kind of, you know, clear cut. But ultimately, that is the kind of murky world we're all functioning in. And the more we're able to embrace that, the more we're able perhaps to find a way through that doesn't mean ultimately that our relationships are going to fall apart. I'm very sad to hear about the 3 couples you've been working with. It must take a toll on you as well as a practitioner working with them. I mean, it's very sad to see couples splitting up.
It is.
So our culture seems to have lost the ability to agree to disagree. Mike, in all your experience of working with couples and with conflict, what have you found the key things are to remember? But before we end up, just in how my arguments always develop is that there's something festering between one of us or both of us, and that becomes sort of unruly conflict, and then after a while we calm down and maybe have a slightly more vulnerable and transparent conversation. But Mike, is there any way that we can avoid this cycle?
Well, look, you know, as you probably know, this subject is one of my favorite subjects. And if I can just go back a few steps, Steve, which is, when I came up with the theme, you know, what has love got to do with it? Of course, that comes from Tina Turner's song. And it kind of just kept, I think they call it an earworm. It was just kind of going round and round in my head, the song. And I was just thinking, wow, that is really interesting. What has love got to do with it? So that was the kind of the starting point. But of course, you know, I've been working with couples for probably about 25, 26 years. And my view is that it's the most challenging and difficult body of work to do. And I don't know if that's true for anybody else on the panel. But at the end of the day, what couples are looking for in therapy is they are looking for tools, they are looking for strategies, they are looking for methodologies that are going to actually help them transform their life. Now, one of the things I do want to say is I'm involved in the second phase of the Gottman method. John Gottman has been involved in couples work for over 40 years. I don't know if any of the other panelists know who I'm talking about.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, so he talks about something really interesting. He talks about the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse.
Yeah.
So he talks about criticism. He talks about contempt. He talks about defensiveness, and he talks about stonewalling. Now, you know, I'm not here to promote John's work. However, what's beautiful about that particular methodology, it does give people the opportunity to identify what are the antidotes to that. He has many antidotes, and in terms of the anger management work that I do, I, of course, have many antidotes. So just to develop on the question that you've asked, the first thing what we have to do is we have to be respectful of each other's needs. That's where we start. Because the problem is that while we focus on the symptoms and not on the needs, it creates the kind of turmoil that both Snake and what you were talking about, David, that's where part of the problem is. And what I mean by that is that, you know, I'm angry with you because you said you're going to clear the dishwasher and you haven't done so. And I've been clearing the dishwasher for days. We focus on the dishwasher and you're not clearing it. And you become defensive and you start talking about what I don't do. And as long as we do that, we remain in what is called the hostility loop. Another term for it is we remain in an impasse. Now, to jump the curve is we have to identify what do we need, what's driving that, what's underneath that. So I don't feel valued and respected by you. And of course, paradoxically, you don't feel valued and respected by me. And until, coming back to what you were saying, Snake, this idea of before I can love you, I need to love myself. I think there's something to be said about before I can value and respect you, guess what? I have to value and respect myself, because I have no idea what it means to value and respect you until I've been able to embrace and embody that. So look, that's just one example. The other example is that we really, really need to hear each other. And I think that's part and parcel of the problem, because when we get into conflicts, and if I can just go back a few steps, I had an experience about 3 weeks ago in my relationship with my girlfriend, Marina. And what I noticed is that when we get into conflict, there is no room for creativity. There's no choices and there's no possibility. So part of the process is to hear each other. Now, I've also been in situations where I've had an argument which gone for 2, 3, or 4 hours, and eventually we both recognize, hold on a second, we both want the same things. The problem is the way we go around getting the same things, and it's all in the listening. That's the second thing that's important here. The third thing is we have to have, in my opinion, a healthy relationship with our feelings. If I'm mind identified, or if I'm disassociated from feelings, how can I even empathize with you? The only way I can really empathize with you is if I have an intimate relationship with my own feelings. So I'll leave those 3 comments, and I'm hoping that we can either develop on them or find some of the other solutions and strategies as part of the panel.
I love that, Mike. And actually, I have some strategies which I use with my couples, which I think take some of those ideas further, particularly around listening and how we listen to each other. And I love Gottman's work. And I also, in my own practice, use the work of David Schnark and the idea of differentiation, which again is absolutely about the both self-love and self-acceptance piece, but also that we're self-aware enough to be able to recognize our own feelings and feel confident, but also vulnerable enough to share those feelings, even in the hostile environment of a conflict with a partner, which takes some practice. But I do work with my clients in order to give them the skills to do that, both to recognize their feeling, but also to be vulnerable enough to share what that feeling is, which might be fear or sadness or feeling ignored or whatever it might be, to their partner in the heat of the moment. But the moment that the couple starts to engage with these tools, it takes so much of the heat out of the conflict and moves the space to something that becomes much more collaborative, that we're in this together, and that the relationship itself needs to heal, and that we have a skill set that enables us to do that.
So David, Steve, just to develop on what you just said, and I'll keep it very brief. You know, when we get into conflict, it's always I, or you. So the challenge is, where is the we? Not the I or the you. Where is the we in all of this?
Absolutely.
And that in itself becomes transformative based on what you're saying.
There's another piece I'd like to throw in here too, and it's a tool that Mike and I discovered years ago. And it's when we talk about being aware of our own emotions, there's a template that I use in my own head. What actually happened? What's the data? What judgment do I make around it? What's the emotion that I'm having around it? And what do I want? So one of the things we're talking about is with someone else. That's a relationship. But it's informed in a big way by my internal dialogue that differentiates those two things enough to know what I'm feeling, or at least have a good idea what I'm feeling. And that, for me, paves a way to communicate a lot clearer, rather than just be in reaction and do the you.
Absolutely.
Sorry, there's one other element, Snake, in that structure is shadow projection, owning up to our own shadows. And maybe you can just talk a little bit about that. I'd appreciate it.
Yeah, I mean, that the shadow concept opens us up to a whole different thing too. But, you know, I'm of the firm belief that most of what's in shadow of us is loving, generous, and wanting to come together. But in the moment of being hurt or feeling judged, it drops deeper into shadow. So, and by shadow, to demystify that, it's what we may not be aware of or conscious of, nonetheless is a part of who we are and how we express ourselves.
I think it's very difficult to be vulnerable and compassionate, certainly at the start and the heat of an argument, and maybe we can talk about that in a bit. But let's talk to Vicky. So Vicky, there's a lot of arguments in your books. Why do you think you have been drawn to writing about conflict, or albeit in a humorous way as much as a dramatic one?
Good question. Well, I grew up in a household where one of the members of the family was very comfortable expressing anger quite forcefully, and the others weren't at all. And I personally have never been comfortable with anger because of that. I find anger quite scary and have therefore become quite avoidant around it externally, but certainly in my interior monologue, there's plenty of conflict. And at the same time, I am very drawn to drama, and the essence of drama in terms of writing is conflict. I'm not the sort of writer who will write 3 pages about what light looks like when it's hitting a stone. I write about relationships and trying to make sense of the world through other people, and also I write about sort of understanding more about yourself. So I think I have a background in sort of being interested in conflict, but also it feels very safe to explore something like that on the page in a way that I totally don't feel safe doing that in real life. Plus, it's really, really fun to write comedic argument because you have all the luxury of time, which you don't have in real life when you have conflict. So you can say the perfect, pithy, hurtful thing if you choose to, in a way that, you might say things you regret. And I think in a way, again, it's a displacement activity. I can do it on the page so that I don't have to do it in real life. Yeah, I think that's probably why.
And what have you learned about yourself through an artistic examination of conflict in relationships?
Interesting, picking up on what you said earlier about the power of listening. And I think what I've learned from writing a lot of adrenaline-based dialogue where people are in conflict is to be quiet and to breathe and to not react, and to give yourself time to, as you said, Mike, sort of go from your head to your body, the embodiment thing. Because I always used to think I was brilliant at my feelings, but I was thinking my feelings, and I even now still struggle with feeling feelings. I can acutely describe them. I can be very articulate in words, but I'm still not very good at moving from head to body. So, yeah, I think that's pretty much the answer.
That was beautiful. And how about, you're in a relationship-based 12-step group. Is it okay to talk a bit about that? Yeah. And I mean, but what have you taken away from that to bring positively into your relationship?
I think one thing I did not know about myself until I started recovery and 12-step was my own role in my life. I come from my earliest memory of my mother, not to throw her under a bus, but my earliest memory of her was she was in the kitchen, I was in another room, I was 4, and she dropped something and she said, "Look what you made me do." And I am really good at blaming other people, and I'm really good at blaming myself. And blame is not the same as responsibility, as far as I can now understand. So what 12-step has taught me, amongst many things, is to own my part in situations which are unhealthy, and rather than say, "Look at what you've done," to take responsibility for my feelings, my behavior, and my reactions. Because there's 2 people in a relationship, and you may not like something, but at some level you're choosing it.
Wow, that's quite a journey for you, Vicky, and well done for the work that you're doing, because you know, building our self-awareness and really taking responsibility is, you know, one of the biggest challenges of all. I mean, in my practice, what I'm always impressed by is that people walk through the door to begin this work. I mean, for me, my concern is always for the people that, in a sense, don't walk through the door because they think everything's fine, or it's always somebody else's fault, or, you know, that there is very little taking of responsibility. Yeah, it's a courageous process and a courageous journey, but that's wonderful. But just to jump in with a listening tip, if you like, I mean, one of the first exercises I do with couples, particularly in conflict, is to give them each 5 minutes to speak about what's really going on for them. But for the partner, husband, wife, whoever is in the room with them, to really listen closely, so at the end of the 5 minutes that they don't react to what they've heard and say, you're right, you're wrong, that's crazy, whatever, but to actually say, so it sounds like you're saying XYZ, you know, it's a listening exercise. It's an exercise in really hearing each other, and then the roles are reversed. So it's 5 minutes to the other person. And it's so powerful just to suddenly, it's a bit like putting some oil back in the machine. The machine's got really stuck and they've got into this very conflicted space. And this is kind of like pouring oil back into the machine, like the cogs can start to move again. There's the beginning of listening where, oh, I didn't quite realize that's how you really felt about this, or that's your position. And it's like, without that ability to listen and to really start the conversation, then that conflict is just going to just atrophy the relationship to such a degree that, to your point, Snake, you know, the couples may well feel that there is no future. And that can be, you know, such a loss and potentially a real tragedy. I mean, my frustration with the couples work is that sometimes I feel if only the couple had come 6 months earlier or a year earlier, you know, it's often thrown in at the very last minute. It's like, well, we'll just try some therapy then. That should sort us out because we're heading for the exit. And it sometimes feels too little too late, which is a shame.
I would agree. And, you know, Vicky just brought up something interesting. What she knows about herself in terms of, I got really good at blaming others and myself. That kind of awareness, I think, is critical, along with the communication. It informs the communication. In other words, when I think about what weapons do I come into a disagreement with, one of the ones I rely on is I can disappear. I can leave.
Right.
And I can punish other people by going silent and just leaving the conversation entirely.
Passive aggression, absolutely.
And for me, that's one of my go-to weapons if I'm in that defensive place. It's good for me to know that, because when I do feel like leaving, I know I'm just pulling out a weapon. And it's that type of awareness, whether it's blaming or over the top anger or just vacating the whole conversation. We all have our individual tools that work for us. Knowing that about ourselves is incredibly important and valuable to being in a disagreement in a healthy way.
So let me just pick up on a couple of things, because I'm pulling together some strands based on what you were saying, David and Snake. So, you know, it's in the context of my body of work. One of the biggest issues that I'm constantly faced with is how quick people are to invalidate each other's experiences. And I think, you know, from my perspective, you know, based on the amount of work I've done over many years, this is where I think the fragmentation or the rupturing of the relation emerges, or the relationship emerges, which is that as we invalidate each other's experiences, it does something to the quality and the love in the relationship. And so if I can just give some examples of that, and very simple examples, you know, I might say to you, Snake, I'm feeling really cold. And your response would be something like, what are you talking about? How can you say you're feeling cold? It's bloody boiling out here. Immediately, I know that he hasn't heard me. Now, what happens is that I feel hurt because he hasn't heard me. So what I'll do at some point where he's wanting some kind of empathetic response or some kind of validation, I will use that against him. So he might say, my God, I'm really hungry right now. And I'll look at him and say, well, what are you talking about? We just had lunch a half an hour ago. How can you be hungry? You get that? And so part of the work I do is constantly reminding people to stop invalidating each other's experiences. That's where the problem lies, in my learned experience. And it's not about, and, we were talking about this earlier on, it's not about making people right or wrong. As you said, Snake, we can agree to disagree. Now, the key component there for me is that we live in the realms of duality. I'm right, you're wrong, shut up. And if you think about some of Brene Brown's presentation, she uses that particular example. And as long as we are seeing the world in black and white, right and wrong, good and bad, and should and shouldn't, it's really difficult to have the kind of intimate relationships based on reciprocity. And by the way, Snake, that's a word I learned from you many years ago when you spoke about reciprocity coaching. I don't even know if you remember that. But in order for there to be reciprocity in any relationship, and it's irrelevant what the relationship is, it has to be based on a mutual understanding, a mutual respect. And so that's the one part that I think is kind of fundamental. Now, if you feed needs into that, a lot of the people I work with, when I introduce this concept of primary needs, what really happens is their eyes glaze over because they have no idea what I'm talking about. They often think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs: warmth, clothes, food, shelter. Those are not the kind of needs I'm talking about. Maslow talks about ego needs. I talk about primary needs. And when I talk about primary needs, I'm talking about feeling valued and respected and appreciated, understood and cared for and loved, etc., etc. And that is part and parcel of that rupturing that happens in the relationship, because if we are not sensitive to each other's needs, emotional needs, that is, it's very difficult to have a relationship based on reciprocity. And it's irrelevant what the relationship, whether it's a love relationship or, of course, whether it's a professional relationship or even a personal relationship. So I just want to add that to the mix.
Mike, can you just explain what you mean by reciprocity?
Well, essentially give and take.
Right.
And then it comes back to something that you were talking about earlier on, David, which is around compromise. And in fact, Steve, you and I were thinking about our next conversation, which is about
win-win or lose-lose.
Lose-lose. Because I'm of the perspective that when we get into compromising, there's always somebody else that feels like they're compromising more than the other person. So, what will happen is I'll say to Snake, Snake, what are you talking about? I always compromise. And he'll look at me in shock and horror and say, are you crazy? When last did you compromise? Now I have to remember. And then I would, instead of remembering, I say, well, when last did you compromise? And a compromise can take 30 seconds, a minute, maybe 5 minutes, but a win-win can take years. And so I'm not comfortable with compromising, because also I think there's something to be said about when we compromise, and there is something to be said, and I don't know whether anyone agrees with me, and I'd love to know whether you do or not, is that when a relationship is competitive, there's no compromise. When a relationship is not competitive, there's compromise until the individual is sick and tired of compromising, and then it becomes competitive. And I would love somebody's view on that.
I'm really grateful that you and I aren't married, Michael, because we'd have some terrible disagreements. And, you referenced Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And one of the things I discovered a long time ago was that towards the end of his life, Maslow was considering adding another level to the hierarchy of needs. That other level was transcendence. So how about we replace the word compromise with the ability to transcend difficulties and come at it from that standpoint?
Yes.
Transcendence, not in the sense of going to God, rather the ability to transcend conflict in our lives in a healthy way. And, tend to approach it that way. When you talk about reciprocity, I'm in relationships because I want something. I want the connection. I want the support. I want something. That implies that it's a transaction where I need to contribute as well. It's not just about me. How do we transcend that selfish parts of ourselves? I'll speak for me. How do I transcend that selfish part of me in order to really be in a healthy disagreement and find that third place neither of us imagined?
Wow. Well, can I? Sorry, Steve. Can I just say something? Vicky, I am curious. Considering your AA, whatever AA background it is, one of the things I'm very aware of is we talk about surrendering to something so much bigger than ourselves, and I'm wondering whether you're meaning the same thing, Snake.
Close to it.
Okay.
Well, I think it's a really interesting idea, transcendence, because I think the pinnacle of the Maslow model was self-actualization. So it's like another layer above that. Self-actualization for me feels quite transcendent. I mean, to really, be fully ourselves, to be our true, authentic selves in any given moment is pretty profound. But I kind of love the idea of transcendence in the sense of a couple, because there is more than the two individuals. There is me, there's you, and there's us, okay? And the us part is the transcendent part. It's the thing that's bigger than either you or I. It's the thing that we create together. One of my frustrations, I feel, is a kind of cultural one about the expectation around relationships, particularly intimate, loving relationships, that somehow this person is going to fulfill me. This person is going to make everything perfect. This person is going to, I'm never going to feel sad or lonely or uncomfortable or confused ever again, because they are going to fulfill every moment of my life from this moment. And it is a romantic myth. It's a delusion. It creates and feeds a huge amount of disappointment. And then it fuels this conflict, because it's like, well, you're not the person that you presented to me, or the person I thought I was falling in love with. And when we come out of the honeymoon period, which is now a very well recognized almost neurological state of, certain parts of the frontal cortex being switched off, because we're in this kind of falling in love moment. And that eventually calms down, and we see the real person, and they see the real us. And that's often when the conflict really starts to come into the relationship. So I use a quote from a wonderful thinker and writer, David White, which is, relationships over time are a mutual exploration of our imperfections, which is much less, it's not going to sell many rom-com books, if you like, but it's a much more realistic expectation. What are we doing over these many years of our relationship? We're mutually exploring our imperfections. And also it kind of fuels a kind of humor, if you like, a kind of not taking ourselves too seriously, because I think humor is such a wonderful balancing tool when conflict, if we can find things to laugh at, even in the heat of a conflict, then there is so much health in the relationship. There's so much worth fighting for, if you like, because if we can laugh at each other, laugh at the crazy things we're ending up saying to each other, and here we go again, and we can, in a sense, allow the relationship, the dynamic of the relationship, to as a kind of way of thinking about the relationship and holding it, and just to remind ourselves, oh God, we were arguing about this years ago. Do you remember that? How did we get through that? Oh God, we're so silly going over this again. That kind of quality of slightly ribbing each other in those moments can just be so healthy to sort of start finding some balance again.
So are you? Go ahead, Steve.
It sounds a bit like it's not just the two people in the relationships. It sounds like the cultural diaspora is having quite a lot of influence on relationships at the moment. We've spoken about the culture's inability to agree to disagree, and other things as well. But and I was struck by what we said about competitiveness, and how maybe in some modern relationships, we all like to think that we're strong and independent, don't we? That's our kind of external identity, even if it might not be related to any sort of work we're doing internally. Is there any way we can stop sort of immediately introducing that competitive element at the beginning of an argument?
I think that's individual too, in that I've been in relationships where they've been very competitive and ones that aren't. So a lot of it has to do with just the internal makeup of the individuals. Uh, I know some couples who fight like cats and dogs, and that is core to the relationship being transparent and healthy. Somehow it works for them. To be in that kind of conflict for me would not work, but it does for some. So the personal preference and how you deal with that is incredibly important. There isn't a template. And another thing I wanted to mention is not all relationships work. And so we haven't a magic bullet that makes all of them work. People change, and what they want changes. And the litmus test for me and the clients I spoke with this week is, are you willing? Not only are you willing to be in the relationship, but are you willing to look at yourself? Because I know for me, when I've left relationships, it's because I simply wasn't willing anymore, due to whatever reasons. So, back to our tagline at the beginning, are you willing to love? Are you willing to be generous? That's a real vital question. And I know for myself, I haven't always been.
I think that's a really valuable addition to our conversation, Snake. I mean, the idea that not all relationships can be sustained and not all relationships will last forever. That relationships can have a beginning, a middle, and an end, like a great story, Vicky. This idea that they have to be sustained no matter what, I think is incredibly burdensome and not realistic. And probably some of our ideals around romantic love were instigated hundreds of years ago when life expectancy was much shorter. So the idea that, you would meet somebody perhaps in your late teens, early 20s, in a heterosexual relationship, start a family, your kids might grow up, and then you're probably approaching the end of your life. So this idea of another relationship or even another relationship would have been kind of unlikely just because of the scale of people's lives. Now, the chance that we may have an intimate, meaningful relationship 2, 3, or even 4 times throughout the lifespan seems much more possible. So the idea that relationships end is also a healthy concept as well, not to threaten it to a partner, saying, well, we're kind of, we're not going to survive this is over. Because I think, our culture is also feeding this kind of much more of an idea of this doesn't suit me, so therefore I'm going to, send it back to the store. We're not learning skills about kind of holding on to things or, ways of managing conflict and so on, which is obviously what we're here to share today, which can be really helpful. But also to recognize that some relationships do need to end, and it's probably the healthiest conclusion as well, that we part the ways. Vicky, I'm in a second long-term relationship myself, and I've learned much from my first relationship, and I'm grateful that I'm not in that relationship anymore, because I think the relationship I have now is much healthier.
Vicky, what imaginative ways have your characters found to either resolve their relationships or decide to end them?
Well, they self-actualize in the end. They go up the Maslow pyramid. In essence, I mean, my sister always tells me that my books are all the same, and they're really, really not. But generally, there is a heroine involved with a man who is either commitment phobic, emotionally abusive, emotionally immature, but the heroine herself has attracted that because the heroine is that too. But the heroine, through a combination of sort of, hard work, quite frankly, and self-awareness, manages to understand what a boundary is and want more for herself. I mean, the most recent book, it's about a relationship between a woman in her 40s who is going out with an emotional avoidant. His attachment style is very avoidant, and she is very insecure attached. Is that the right term? Sorry, because I'm probably using the wrong term.
Yes, all correct. Well done.
But she meets, is it Bowlby? I like Bowlby. Anyway, whatever.
Yeah, Bowlby.
Because the boyfriend has a wobble and she is left in limbo, whereas if she had better boundaries, she would have walked away. She puts it, well, he goes into therapy and she is so obsessed with wanting to know what's going to happen and to be able to control the outcome that a friend of hers encourages her to volunteer as a way of, you know, doing service and doing something outside of herself and to take her mind off it. And through the course of volunteering, she forms a friendship with a 97-year-old woman who is also stuck in her life, but in a very different way. And I think the older woman offers a perspective and offers her a massive lesson in self-esteem. I mean, the character in the novel, for various reasons in her biography, has no sense of entitlement. Entitlement's such a loaded word now, but she has very low standards and low expectations. And while I'm not a fan of unrealistic expectations, I think you get what you think you deserve, and she is not self-assured or confident for various reasons. So yes, there's always a journey. That is the nature of the novel. And I mean, people call them romantic comedies. My books are the opposite of romantic comedies. They are anti-romantic comedies. And my editors always make me put in a happy ending with a hero. And I always rail against it because the whole point is you put in the relationship to make you happy. But they keep on making me wheel on a Bradley Cooper at the end. So there you go.
Can I just, Steve, I just want to interrupt the conversation because I think there's something to be said in the question that Edith is asking in the stream.
Sure. She's Edith Hay, and thank you very much for your question, which is, does trauma make one emotionally deaf?
Wow, that's quite a question, isn't it? Does trauma make one emotionally is the word deaf?
Yeah, she's put deaf, but that was a typo. She later corrected.
Oh, deaf, so
or deaf. Does trauma make us unable?
I'm curious to know what other people on the panel will say, but I think, trauma could be, of course, by its very nature, devastating. And I think, any kind of massive upset in our lives is always a crossroads and an opportunity at some point to grow through that or to be absolutely floored by it, and we don't find a way through. Obviously, I don't know the nature of the trauma that Edith is particularly concerned with, but I can just share something of my own experience. I was in a relationship for 14 years, and I thought this was going to be forever. It ended very tragically with the drug addiction of my partner. And I was absolutely heartbroken, fought the addiction, felt I could do everything I can to save him from himself, and it absolutely failed. And I was devastated and felt that I couldn't ever be in a new relationship, that I could never really trust anybody again. It was absolutely traumatizing, but it actually opened up a new path in my life, because from that experience I ended up in therapy. I found the therapy very helpful. It inspired me to start the process of becoming a therapist myself, and to really realize just how vulnerable people are, that they can present in very kind of self-actualized ways, if you like, and seem to lead very together lives, but underneath that they are crumbling and falling apart. So it was a very powerful experience, so incredibly traumatic. But, through that experience, it gave me a new direction in my own career. It brought huge amounts of self-awareness, huge amounts of sensitivity to the vulnerabilities of others, and a way of working now, which is ultimately a huge gift to myself and hopefully to some of the people I work with. So from that terrible, terrible loss and trauma, something new for me in my life has grown very powerfully. And also now I've been in a new relationship, which, we just celebrated being together 18 years, married 6 years ago. I think ultimately a much healthier relationship through the trauma of the loss of my previous relationship. And, tragically, he's no longer alive. So, it really did end in the worst possible way it could have done. And yet from that, in a sense, from that horror, something I think really worthwhile has grown. So I think as long as there's life, there's always hope. And I think as long as we can find the support we need through that trauma, whatever it might be, then, really amazing things can happen. and we grow through the difficulties. You know, when things are good, we're having a good time, but it's not that we wish difficulties or challenges, but actually that's really, it's the grit that makes the pearl in our lives. It really is. So yeah, there is hope, I would say to you, for sure.
And thanks for that, David. I'm quite touched and moved by your example of trauma, how trauma can actually lead to self-realization and transform your life, and in your case, transforming the lives of so many people that you're already working with. So thanks very much for that. I wanted to just develop on that, not the death aspect of it, but what I'm very aware of, certainly within the context of the client group that I work with. Most people whose anger is extreme, what we call aggressive anger, is directly linked to trauma. And so the only way I can describe that is the argument or the issue that they're dealing with turns into an absolute dogfight. And the reason why it turns into a dogfight is simply because of unprocessed, unfinished business from their past. So we talk about regressive anger. And the key indicators for that is, one is compassion and empathy takes a vacation. The other is stuff the consequences, I'll deal with the consequences later. The issue itself is disproportionate to what was said, not said, done or not done. And of course, whatever's going on in their body. So it is re-stimulating historical trauma. And one of my mentors, a chap by the name of John Lee, wrote a book called Growing Yourself Up Again. And John's a huge, huge mentor of mine. I mean, profoundly influential in the work that I do. And it's a technique which helps us to integrate the trauma. And the interesting thing about this, as far as I'm concerned, is that if you look at it from the perspective of neuroscience, there's a rupturing in those neural pathways. Once you integrate that trauma, it's almost like the electricity is reconnected, and our capacity to deal with the historical trauma within the context of what was said or not said today actually becomes transformative. And what I mean by that is, yes, I'll feel angry. The only difference is that I won't act the anger out. And by the way, I'd say, 100% of the people that I work with, the reason that they come is because they're not aware of the trauma that underlies their anger, rage, and fury. So I just want to kind of add that to the pot. And of course, you and I, Snake, have had this conversation around anger, and underneath anger is grief.
Right.
Yeah.
I think it bears noting, too, that the question is emotionally deaf. And I take exception to that because I don't think that's really possible. But I understand what she's asking, too, in that trauma survivors oftentimes are, like you say, in the past. Their reactions are in the past. And so emotional access to the present is interrupted by that unreconciled trauma. And so, in effect, they are deaf to the emotions in the present. I find it a very interesting question. And the ability to reconcile that trauma, not wipe it away. I'm not a big fan of healing trauma. It tends to stick around a little bit longer than something you can heal. But being aware of trauma and its impact on our ability to be in the present, that's critical.
A question to you, Snake, is why, just can you develop on that when you say you're not a fan of healing trauma? Is that what I heard?
Yeah.
Can you just develop on that? I'd like to understand more about that.
I think David put it very well. Trauma, what I mean is David's able to look back and see a traumatic instance turn out to be to his gain.
Okay, got it.
And so it's not about reconciling the past, we're beyond that. But it is about what you do with the trauma that you've suffered over your life, no matter whether it's minor or major. And it's what have you learned and how will you use it going forward? I mean, that's the watchword of wisdom.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The word I would use is integration. I mean, this idea, there's
Yeah.
this kind of myth of getting over or putting something behind you, or, you know, but we, you know, we're like snails. We carry our houses on our backs. You know, we are the sum total of all of our experiences. But the difference is that we've processed these experiences, we've integrated them. They become part of our story, if you like,
Right.
and we are conscious of them and aware of them. And we, hopefully, through that self-awareness, are aware of the kind of triggers that are likely to promote certain kind of responses from us, and to know whether, you know, from it, going briefly back to my story. So one of my big triggers was, you know, how do I trust again when I've been in a relationship where there's been so much deception and kind of things which have been hidden and a kind of mask wearing on the part of my partner. So in a new relationship, I was incredibly suspicious, you know, like crazily suspicious, you know, of, you know, why didn't you call me when you said you're going to call me? And this was all playing out from a previous relationship, which was nothing to do with the relationship I was in. So I had to, through the work I was doing, through, you know, my own therapy and training to be a therapist and so on, you know, really having to look clearly at that and to think, this is not about what's going on around me now. This is to do with my past. I need to, you know, integrate that, accept that it probably always be a trigger for me. And I think it still is a trigger for me, but the volume on it has been turned down over the years, thankfully. But it is about integration. You know, we are the sum total of our experiences. But they can be handled in ways which are much less harmful to us and harmful to our relationships. So we can reawaken, we can still be fully alive. It's a bit like, you know, this sounds trivial in a way, but, you know, whether one should have plastic surgery or not. And you know what? I've earned these wrinkles. Like it's like I don't carry my past with shame. I carry it with, you know, what it's, you know, they're my war wounds, and, you know, I'm not proud of them or not, you know, or anything other than they are part of my story, and I carry them hopefully without shame. And that's how I integrate them. So I think what you're saying, Snake, is absolutely true. This idea of getting over is a myth, I think, and it gives us a kind of false hope around something which it's the wrong kind of metaphor, if you like. We need to integrate and you know, not hold on to, but accept that they are part of who we are, and that we can handle them differently.
I like the word repurpose too. Over time, that trauma, that experience can be repurposed.
That's nice. Yeah, I like that too.
Yeah. So why I asked the question came from the famous words of Arnold Mindell, the founder of process-oriented psychology. And I remember I was attending one of his workshops, and he said there are some traumas that are not meant to heal. I think that's what you're probably both alluding to. And, you know, if I think about the death of my father, trying to heal that trauma, it's just like, it ain't going to go away. And it's about how do I use that trauma to repurpose my life, using your words. So it's very interesting listening to what's been said, and thank you.
So got another question from Johnny, listening live, and he's asking, what happens if the two sides of the argument, you know, the two of you, have conflicting coping mechanisms? And the example he uses is, what if one person prefers to cope by going away and having a bit of space, but the other one is very keen to get some closure and to talk, and that's their own coping mechanism?
Great question. Thanks, Johnny.
Great question. Yeah.
That's one that I struggle with myself, in that if I'm in a disagreement, particularly with an intimate partner, and I'm being pressed, what do you feel? What do you want? It takes me a moment to figure that out. I don't have it in my hands in an instant. And so, particularly with my wife, we've had to negotiate and get used to different fighting styles, in that she wants to hang in there till there's reconciliation. I can't reach reconciliation till I've had a chance to check in with myself and see, what am I feeling? What do I want? And for me, that takes time. It's a slow burn. And for her, it's a fast burn. And we're able to more or less respect that in each other. But it was terribly hard in the beginning because when I asked for that space, she experienced it as abandonment. So that's a difficult one. And it's really core to disagreements between couples, different fighting styles.
Well, you know, I think it comes back to what you were saying, Nikki, early on about Bowlby and attachment styles. You know, I think there's something to be said, and if I can just get really cognitive about this, I think there is a difference between, say, for example, the insecure attachment versus the avoidant or the ambivalent attachment. And there's something about when somebody feels insecure, they want to resolve it as quickly as they can because it's overwhelming, it's traumatizing. But somebody who has an avoidant attachment needs time to process their thoughts and feelings and will come back in their own time. So it's all about timing. But then I think part of what, well, I'm assuming this is part of what Johnny's asking is that how do those who experience an insecure attachment, of which, you know, that's my attachment, deal with my own distress in that moment? And that, of course, is the million-dollar question.
If I could just add something in as well, I mean, there's a lot of research that implies that many relationships do have this kind of avoidant dynamic because, you know, the avoidant figure and the insecure figure are like two sides of a coin. They kind of find each other. So that dynamic is actually a very common dynamic in relationships because that insecure style comes from probably an avoidant parent from the childhood of that individual. So it gets played out in their adult relationships. So, I mean, going back to the idea of I guess the transcendent ideal of the kind of relationship as a holding space for the couple, for the two individuals, have actually, and it sounds like you, Snake, in your relationship over time have learned to recognize these different styles. They're neither right nor wrong, they're just different between you and your wife. And the fact that you have that recognition, which is you, in a sense, recognizing your relationship and what it needs, that you have these tendencies, you recognize them, you can talk about them, and that you know that these are ways that you're likely to behave. So it gives you a kind of a broader ground on which to find each other. It's like, you know, I'm not abandoning you, but you know what, I need to go for a walk for half an hour to really kind of clarify my thinking, and then I'm really happy to continue the conversation with you, and let's sort this out. You know, and perhaps over time your wife realizes that you're not running away to not come back, but you just need that time. And she trusts that you will come back and re-engage with the conflict, whatever it might be. So it's really, you know, using the relationship, holding the idea of the relationship as a holding space, as a crucible or as a catalyst for the conflict to be resolved. But within that, acknowledging our differences.
Vicky, sorry.
I really relate to how you were describing it, and I relate from your wife's point of view in terms of I find it very difficult to sit with the feelings, and if someone needs time away, I was with a partner who could not respond, needed a lot of time to process and respond, and it made me feel so unsafe and anxious. But I think through recovery, what I've learned is that it is up to me to self-regulate at that point. But if I want to be in a relationship with this type of person, it's not personal, but you know, my reaction is mine to try and regulate, because it's very hard to, as you know, implied in the question, there is not, you know, there are extremes of I want resolution now because I can't sit with my feelings versus I don't want the pressure of this because I need to process it. And, you know, it's a challenge, but I feel like it was my responsibility ultimately to regulate myself rather than have my needs met immediately, which I think was a result of, you know, an insecure attachment style, which I'm not sure actually, Mike and Snake and David, you know, to what degree can you change your attachment style?
I don't think you can.
Okay.
What's your take, Mike?
Well, look, I think because I've had to challenge my own attachment style. My attachment style is insecure. And within the context of Johnny's question, you see, what I want from the ambivalent or the avoidant is I want them to reassure me that it's going to be okay. that everything's going to be okay, and I love you and I care for you, and just let me take some time to resolve this. But of course, because they've already, what I would judge to be stonewalling me, or withdrawing their love is even more existential. And what I've had to do is I've had to reassure myself, Mike, it's going to be okay. And, find your own way to dealing with your distress. They just need time out. And, the question, of course, is which part of me am I talking to? And it does go back to what you were saying, David. My mother, her attachment was ambivalent, avoidant. So, of course, I end up being insecure. And so what I've had to do is to that child part of me is to talk to him. Now, I'm not suggesting that I don't still have an insecure attachment. But what I am suggesting is that I have found my own strategy of reassuring myself that it's going to be okay. That's what I wanted from my mother when she withdrew her love, because that's the way she punished me.
Sure.
And so what I've had to do, of course, is I've had to learn how to reassure myself, which I'm able to do today. But it doesn't mean that it doesn't affect me. It just means that I don't allow it to overwhelm me.
Yeah.
And of course, I do notice as I get older, there are a few other attachment styles that start to kind of creep out of, the floorboards or through the walls, through the crevices and the cracks in my own, psychopathology. But I didn't mean to interrupt you, David. I just wanted to.
No, I think you're articulating something very similar, I think, to what I would have said. I mean, back to your point, Vicky, I love the phrase self-regulation. I mean, I think the attachment style, I think, is pretty hardwired because it comes to us so early in our development. I mean, it's very hard to, I don't know, maybe there's some research, but I think to literally change that attachment style is pretty difficult. However, through self-awareness, through our own, progress, our own therapy, our own, gaining ever greater amounts of self-awareness, self-actualization, whatever we want to call it, we know it and we can see it. And to your point, Mike, we can strategize ways of handling it that it doesn't keep tripping us up, or we go down the same path every time that we have a moment of conflict with our avoidant partner, that we can sort of sit with it. Your self-regulation phrase, Vicky, that we can, it's uncomfortable for sure, we feel very triggered at that moment, but it's not impossible to sit with. And then something better will come along through our ability to self-regulate in that moment. But it really comes back to that self-awareness piece. Everything starts with, how am I feeling and what's going on for me right now? And I'm wondering, our inner curiosity about ourselves and what is going on for us at any given moment.
I think it bears noting too.
That is incredibly, everything you've just said, both of you, is incredibly helpful to me personally. I think the key thing for me in those moments is to remember compassion above all else, because my initial thing is I shouldn't feel like this, and to reparent yourself compassionately when you perhaps haven't had that modeled for you is the big challenge, but it's doable. It just takes vigilance and gentleness.
Beautiful words. I love that, vigilance and gentleness. Yeah.
I wonder too if disagreement is the very catalyst so important to us developing that self-awareness. I know it has been for me. I remember years ago talking to a man who was going through a terrible divorce, and he looked at me and basically was in surrender mode. And he goes, I don't know, I guess the horns in her head fit the holes in my head perfectly. And
I love that image.
Learning to live with that, much more learning to get the benefit out of it by the self-awareness that comes out of that. That's kind of woven through everything we've talked about. Maybe relationship is that catalyst that forces us to see deeper into ourselves. Certainly can't do that in a mirror.
I don't know where I read this from, but I definitely read somewhere somebody saying being in a long-term relationship is the closest thing to being in therapy other than being in therapy.
Yep.
And I think that's true. I mean, it's like we have to face ourselves, through that intimate relationship, our selfishness, our ego, our, our anger, and there's very few places to hide, and that's a very uncomfortable place to be at times, which is often in those conflict moments. But actually, if we can find a way through the conflict, and I agree with you, I think conflict actually in many ways can be very healthy. You know, I've worked with couples who say, well, we never argue. And I thought, well, that probably means one of you is getting their way all the time and the other one is just kind of silently putting up and suffering, which is obviously not healthy. And at some point, something's going to explode here and it's not going to be pretty. You know, much better to, you know, find tools and strategies to handling the conflict and to expressing all of the needs within the relationship and the couple. And actually the couple will grow and the relationship will become more than it is right now. And it will become a much healthier place.
And the individuals within the relationship,
Absolutely.
Same thing.
Absolutely.
So what I often say to couples that I work with, you know, you can run, but you can't hide, because wherever you go, you take yourself. So what you don't want to do is you don't want to keep replicating the trauma, you know, in your first relationship, which of course is with your mother and probably your father. You don't want to recreate those traumas with the individuals that you're in relationship with. And you know, I'm all for. I'd never ever in my work talk about people divorcing. It's just not my style at all. But I will always suggest, if it's really difficult for them, to actually do a trial separation, because often in a trial separation you reignite or you reactivate the love. You know, so you were talking about earlier on the difference. Well, you were talking about romantic love, David, and I know that Harville Hendricks talks about the unconscious marriage. And a lot of what we're talking about now is how do we make the unconscious marriage conscious? And I think the point you're making, Snake, is that, you know, if we can argue and we can identify a way through the argument rather than demonizing the other person, that in itself is a transformative component to healing.
Absolutely.
Not only the difference in myself, but the difference in each other.
Yep.
So listening to the conversation, I'm reminded about an article I wrote recently with friend of the podcast, TV's Dr. Stephen Blumenthal. Don't worry, female viewers, he'll be back joining us again soon. And it was about how conversations that look like these or questions like these, very much based around good verbal communication skills. And not all of us have especially good verbal communication skills, or some of us express our emotions better through artistic expression. That Vicky, you alluded to this right at the beginning, or that, you know, through our work or through sex or through dance. And how have we become too dependent on verbal communication skills? Do we expect everyone to be able to express their emotions in words? And if you can't, that's just sort of bad luck. You're an emotional have-not, and you just haven't kept pace with technology or something.
I think it's a practice discipline. I really do. Within an environment where the ability to feel emotion, if not express emotion, is encouraged, that's hard to find. It really is. I coach a lot of, you know, people working in the corporate world. Being honest and articulate with your emotions in many companies is a death sentence. So there's a whole strategy that obscures what's actually being felt one way or another. So, you know, can we create an environment, a world where we value emotion as a critical input to being human? That's the goal, I believe.
So look, I constantly talk about developing an emotional narrative. A lot of people that I work with, in fact, I would say at least 95% of the people that I work with, because keeping in mind those are individuals who've done no therapy whatsoever. As soon as somebody checks in one of my groups, I'll hear immediately whether they have a notional narrative. And if they do have, I know that they've been in therapy because they've got the therapy speak. But it really does strike me how many people don't have an emotional narrative. And I do think, part of the work I do and part of the work any therapist will do is help their client or client group to develop an emotional narrative. When I was 30 years old and I started training as a therapist, the question I was asked is, what are you feeling? And I told them what I thought. And this happened to be the therapist at the time. And I've mentioned in these talks before. I said, no, Michael, I don't want to know what you're thinking. I want to know what you're feeling. And I told him what I thought. By the time he asked me the question the fourth time, it's like I realized I have no idea what I'm feeling. Mm. And so for me, an emotional narrative has its currency in being able to communicate and express our feelings. And if I can just be very clear about this, for me, there is a distinction between a feeling and an emotion. I don't think this is the place to discuss it because we come to, nearing the end of our time together. Like we could probably go on for the next 4 hours, what I imagine. But there is something to be said. What is the difference between an emotion and feeling? And if there is a difference, what is it exactly?
That's a very interesting point. But I think back to that question, Steve, I mean, I was educated myself in my feelings and how to articulate them and how they were experienced in my body and what that sensation felt like before my brain kicked in and gave it a name. Or, I remember being really resistant when I trained as a therapist, like with the word jealousy. It's like, I'm just not a jealous person. I'm just really not jealous. And I really resisted that. And actually, it was just because I was jealous because I truly believe we all are to some degree. But it was just something for me that was very hard to acknowledge and accept as part of who I am. So I think a lot of the therapeutic process, whether you're a couple or an individual and whatever has brought you into that space, is actually both learning. It's really an education in emotions and feelings and learning what they are, their correct names, what they feel like in the room. It's almost a cliche of therapy, but to say to a client, wow, that must have been really frightening, or that, wow, that I bet you were really angry when you heard that. I can imagine that would have made you feel really upset or whatever. You're constantly trying to name the emotional register that an experience for a client may have been. And that's not the only space where you can get this education. I mean, perhaps we had very empathic parents who are very, emotionally articulate themselves, and they could help us understand our emotions as we were growing up. But for a lot of us, that really wasn't the case. Or we were just given a very narrow repertoire of acceptable emotions. As a boy, you're allowed to feel angry, you can be joyful perhaps, but you can't feel sad or frightened. But of course you do feel sad or frightened. So where do those emotions go if you've not been given, the acknowledgement that they are part of who you are? So maybe they just all get hidden under the banner of anger, but actually deep down you're really feeling sad or frightened.
I see a lot of fear too, is that
Absolutely.
People are oftentimes hesitant, afraid to open Pandora's box because there'd be no bottom to it.
Yeah.
And, that fear is very much a mirage because, like it or not, you've got emotions and feelings and you do know what they are. You might not be able to articulate them, but that's oftentimes because an environment hasn't been set up to do that.
Mm-hmm.
I remember a real pivotal point for me was seeing a man grieving the loss of his grandfather that he dearly loved. And it was very expressive, very physical, very emotional. And it set down a different model for me, rather around grief, that wasn't just carry on. It was true grief.
Up a lip. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And so the modeling that I've seen over the years has influenced me and given me a greater range in a huge way.
Mm.
Once again, we're back to relationship in terms of, can relationships serve as that model to expand your emotional range? Absolutely.
I agree. We may have a partner who gets incredibly upset or angry or joyful about things that really wouldn't affect us in that way. So that's for me, that would always pique my curiosity. Wow, that's such a different response.
Yeah.
To the world from myself. You know, what can I learn from this? How I wonder why I'm different. What experiences from my past have led me to this place as opposed to their place? I mean, that's just so fascinating to me. But also my work as well with clients. I mean, clients have taught me so much.
Yeah.
You know, about their emotional repertoire and how emotions can be felt and expressed.
Mm-hmm.
So it's learning that never ends.
Yeah.
We're nearing the end of our 90 minutes. Who's got something burning that they desperately need to get off their chest as a form of closure?
Well, I tell you, it's not burning, but you did raise a question, David, or you made a comment about jealousy. Now, I know we don't have time to talk about it, but I think, you know, there's a whole conversation to be had about jealousy. And it's a pity that we don't have the time to develop on it, certainly within the context of what we're talking. Because what I realized, what's that, Steve?
It's an underrated emotion. Jealousy. It's an
a hard one
unfashionable.
to
It's
admit
very
to. Well, for me, it
unfashionable.
was only hard to admit to. Envy and jealousy.
Yeah, definitely.
But maybe that could be another discussion point.
Mm-hmm.
But you see, the thing is, if I can just say this, because this will be my final comment, Steve. You know, having listened to this conversation, which I'm very touched by, and I just find it so rich and interesting, I've made quite a lot of notes for myself. And I think there's also something to be said of, you know, it's not about me being jealous of the fact that you're getting a lot of attention from, you know, the opposite sex or whatever it is. But actually, I'm jealous of you, which maybe that's something I'll never admit to myself and the other person that I'm in, who might be my, you know, who is my partner, who I love and I care for very much. But I'd never admit that to myself. And I think there's something to be said. Well, that I think is the key learning I'm taking away is, would I be willing to own up to my own jealousy within the context? And I feel quite sad when I even make that connection. It's in the context of my own relationship, and admit that not only to my partner, but also to myself. So I think that's my takeaway for today. So thank you.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, I would just like to say this time has just flown, and wonderful stories and experiences shared by everyone here. And it's been a real pleasure to be part of this discussion. And I would just say to everybody out there, you know, conflict really can be healthy, but we can really learn tools which will make us handle those conflicts in ways that just don't feel like life and death. Which can really, you know, to some of the stories we've shared here, you know, actually they can be really growing opportunities. I know that sounds a bit kind of therapy speak, but from my own experience, that absolutely is the case. And conflict really shouldn't be a dirty word at all. You know, conflict really, you know, to use that image again of the grit that makes the pearl. I mean, that's such a perfect metaphor of when things go wrong, something really wonderful can kind of grow from it. But it takes patience, and it takes, you know, a skill set that many of us are still learning, and maybe we'll always be learning, but that's fine too.
Yeah, I'd like to add in that, you know, the question that comes up for me at this point in the conversation is, you know, are you in it to win or in it to grow?
That's beautifully put. I love that. Thanks, Snake.
Guys, thanks so much. Yeah, Vicky, what do you got to say?
I just want to say thank you to you all. I found it fascinating, and I've learned so much, and I need to go and work on my transcendence.
We all do, Vicky. We'll be joining you.
Everybody, thank you so much for joining us today on the Wisdom Track. We're back in November, where Snake and I will be doing a deep dive into his work with prisoners and Special Forces veterans. To find out more about that, subscribe to the Wisdom Track YouTube channel. Remember, like, comment, and subscribe, the maxim. Or you can also subscribe on Apple Podcasts, on Spotify even, and on that thing called Buzzsprout. You can follow us at Facebook/BAAM UK, and you
Lost you, buddy.
sign up newsletter at angermanage.co.uk. Did everyone hear that? Because I blinked out for a bit.
Yeah.
No?
You got the last bit.
You got the last bit. You got the last bit about like, comment, and subscribe. Yeah, because that's the important bit. So we hope you're feeling just a little bit wiser. Until next time, goodbye.
Goodbye.
Mike Fisher has been in the personal and professional development field for over 3 decades. Some of you might know Mike already, attended his anger management programs, or even read some of his books on anger. I'm talking to you today to introduce his new web launch, the Wisdom Track. If you split the word wisdom, you get wise domain. In other words, to inhabit the domain of the wise. And that's the purpose of the Wisdom Track. It's a platform to engage with wise thinking in order to reaffirm who we are in the world and our place in it. It's easy to get lost in the barrage of information that is spewed out to us in every direction daily. But are we able to discern what is true, false, or even critical? We are subjected to the sleights of misinformation with hidden agendas, but do we ever stop to think whether this is enriching the mind or poisoning it? Are we shaping ourselves, or are we allowing all these messages to shape us? Despite all the connectivity of technology, has it in fact made us more vulnerable to being shaped by external forces? And how does this affect our awareness or consciousness, both individually and collectively? You see, there's a personal element to wisdom too. It's different for all of us. It's about finding yourself, knowing what your boundaries and values are, and having a clear dialogue with your inner voice that instinctively knows what's the best course of action for you. We have an inner landscape that is important for us to inhabit. Otherwise, we lose touch not only with ourselves, but with our place in the world, our purpose, and our environment. We are already witnessing the consequences of this disconnection in our world, the lack of care, respect, and connection towards each other, as well as our one and only planet. COVID-19 has given us a rare opportunity to stop consuming and bring our focus into what is essential. So, what is essential for you? Sometimes becoming wise is about asking different questions. The Wisdom Track platform is a place where we can do all of that, where we get to talk, share, listen, and evolve together.